Greetings and bienvenue, MITZU. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Us 5 friends left Daleville, Virginia with the intent to do the 10 miles north on the Appalachian Trail to the Wilson Creek shelter. Myself and another friend were slowly bringing up the rear of our group, and about halfway there we noticed something laying on the side of the trail. We picked it up and examined it, sort of looking at each other like, WTF is this doing here? It was a cutlery kitchen knife, but it was decorated. It had beads and streamers attached to the handle. It seemed like it was fit to replicate some sort of Native American theme. It obviously hadn't been there long. It was clean of debris and dry. It had rained the night before. We moved on to Wilson Creek shelter. When we pulled up to the shelter, the rest of the crew were there. They all had an unsettled look on their face. The 5 of us were the only ones at the shelter, and as I unshouldered my pack, I clearly noticed a lone backpack laying on the front end of the shelter platform. I immediately asked my fellow hikers, whose pack is that? The answer from everyone was, we don't know. Me and one other hiker had just arrived, but the rest of our crew had been there a couple hours, and there was zero sign of a hiker that belonged to this mysterious backpack. So, concerned, I began to slowly investigate the pack contents. The first things I pulled out were gallon zips filled with granola bars. There must have been 150 of them. But as I dug a little deeper, I started pulling out almost a dozen colorfully decorated kitchen knives. One after the other, I plucked them from the abandoned backpack. Common kitchen cutlery knives covered in beads, feathers, and colorful streamers. Also in the pack was a tent, sleeping bag, and stove. All the basics, and all pretty much brand new. The knives really unnerved us all. We started discussing what we should do. It was starting to get dark. Finally, we decided to call the sheriff's department. 3 hours later, around 10 p.m., we saw a light coming through the woods. We all became alert. I had a big stick in my hands. Alas, it was 2 deputies responding to the call. They had hiked in from a road crossing 4 miles north. They were very friendly, thirsty, and their flashlight was dying. I could tell right away the sheriff had not exactly sent his most experienced men, but then again, no one at that point realized that they were dealing with a murderer. Much relieved, we met with the deputies. They began examining the pack. When they discovered the granola bars, they began eating them, as they did their police work. Suddenly, they pulled a note out of the pack. Us hikers had not discovered the note. The deputies unfolded the note and read it aloud. I don't remember everything the note said as the deputies read it aloud, but I'll never forget the first few lines. I am the one who killed his father. You may not know me now, but soon you will all know who I am. My work here. The Appalachian Trail is done. It was the most chilling thing I'd ever heard. Everyone went silent. Then the deputies started up some radio chatter with their two-way. They gathered up the contents of the pack. The deputies explained they were sorry, but they had to go and had to hike back out. So they bid us goodbye, and with their dying flashlight they hiked back out. No one slept that night. I stealth camped in the woods with eyes on the shelter. The next morning, the sheriff RS and a deputy showed up at the shelter asking questions. A week later, our hiking crew went into Buena Vista, Virginia for resupply. A hiker, not within our group, came up to us in town. He had the regional newspaper. On the front cover was the story I just told to you. A 16-year-old had murdered his father in cold blood, stole his credit cards, bought a bunch of gear, and hit the Appalachian Trail as a means of escape. Police had picked him up a week after we found his pack. We had found his pack just a couple hours after he'd left it behind.
I'm a frequent hiker on the Appalachian Trail near my home in southwestern Virginia. I love being outdoors. I've also been a Bigfoot enthusiast for most of my life, but my obsession with the subject is relatively recent. But I never thought I'd have any confirmation of their existence for myself. The following incident is true and can be corroborated by multiple witnesses. I and a small crew of friends section hiked the Appalachian Trail. The first time I heard a Bigfoot call happened when the 3 of us were hiking together. We decided to stay the night in one of the Appalachian Trail shelters for the first evening. I'm not fond of staying in shelters. The hard wooden shelter floors are rough on my back, and I need to get a good sleep if I'm going to have an enjoyable day of hiking. The next night I pitched my tent behind the shelter and immediately made my bed and laid down. I was very tired. I had a snack and I was soon dozing off. There were 2 other groups of section hikers staying at and around the shelter that night. One was a group of 3 guys who all stayed in the shelter, and the other was a couple of middle-aged women. Everyone was fixing dinner and chatting while I lay quietly in my tent. Down the hill from the shelter was a creek. So between the conversations, the camp stoves loudly boiling water for dinners, and the creek, it was kind of noisy in front of the shelter. I was behind it, so it was easier for me to hear the sounds of the vast woods in the distance. Out toward the ridge, I hear this call. It's a howl, but I don't know how to describe it, but it was unusual. There was a dramatic tone change that lasted for a long duration. I had never heard anything like it before. It was far enough away that I couldn't hear it very well. After a while, I did hear it again. This time, there were other calls along with it. I listened closely, but I was so tired that I dozed off. I was sleeping lightly and the next howl woke me up. It had moved. It was across the creek in front of the shelter and down the trail coming from where we had been earlier in the day. The howl was too long and too loud to be a man. A pack of coyotes joined in from the distance. After that, all was quiet and I fell asleep. I didn't dare get out of my tent. I wasn't scared, but I was cautious. The next morning, we all got up as usual and started making breakfast. I brought up the subject from the previous night's howls. Immediately, one of the guys with the other group said that they'd been backpacking for 20 years and they had never heard anything like that. Then one of the ladies in the third group walked up and she said that she and her friends had been talking about it. She was sure that it was a Bigfoot. I'm glad that she said it and not me. Later on, before we all got back on the trail, the same woman told me that the subject of Bigfoot is not usually discussed by Appalachian Trail hikers. There have been a few harrowing encounters not far from where we were, mainly in the George Washington National Forest. One hiker was supposedly attacked and killed by an unknown beast. Also, there had been rumors of men in black or government agents harassing hikers in the past. I'm not sure about what she told me, but I later read about many unexplained incidents occurring on the Appalachian Trail. I'm much more cautious from here on out.
My dad is a retired park ranger, if that's what you call it. He worked for the National Park Service up until 3 years ago. His usual tasks involve taking people on tours along the Appalachian Trail in the Shenandoah National Park, maintaining the forestry and the wildlife habitats that live there. So anyway, this story goes back to the summer of 2003, when my dad and a colleague, we shall call him John, were sent out to try and locate an adult elk, a male named Billy by the locals, who was usually very tame and was often found close to houses, but had not been seen for over a week. This was apparently very unusual for him. So my dad was dropped off along the trail, whilst John took the truck and drove further down, approximately 5 miles, in order to try and locate Billy. They had been searching all day for him, and this was the last stop for the day as there was only a few hours of daylight left. So as the story goes, my dad had been walking along the trail for a little over an hour when he heard a disturbance in the distance off to his left. He could hear the snapping of tree branches, so decided to follow where the noises were coming from, in the hopes that it could be Billy the elk. As he got closer, he said he began to smell a foul odor, and instinctively knew that it was some sort of dead animal. He was right. Laying on the ground, in a small opening of trees, was the carcass of a large elk. He could see by the tag on one of the ears that it was Billy. However, he was immediately shocked by the condition the animal was in. Billy had been severely mutilated, his eyes and tongue had been gouged out, his throat torn out, and his stomach had been ripped open, so that the intestines were protruding onto the ground. He also noticed that little chunks of flesh had been bitten from the torso, and the entire front right leg was missing. He reasoned that the animal had been attacked by either a black bear or coyotes, as nothing else would tackle a fully grown adult elk. However, this seemed strange because elk were usually too big for even apex predators to try to take down. But he thought that maybe a hungry pack of coyotes might, if they were starving. What disturbed him further was the way in which the animal had been mutilated after death. My dad made a point of saying he had never witnessed anything quite like it, and that it was very unusual for predators to mutilate a corpse in such a way. Feeling unnerved by this discovery, my dad radioed John and told him he had located the animal, before giving him his approximate location. John had told him that he had wandered off the beaten track and that it would take him around an hour to get back to where the truck was parked and drive back to his location. So my dad was told to wait where he was until John got to him. It was almost dark at this point, and my dad remembered beginning to feel very unsettled. He had a flashlight with him and bear spray, but noted that he still felt very vulnerable alone in the forest. After around 15 minutes or so, he heard the same noises as he had done earlier, much closer now as he was off the trail. He would hear footsteps and the occasional growl of something hidden within the thick bushes straight ahead of him. He said that every so often he could hear slow, heavy breathing and the snapping of branches as whatever it was paced the forest floor. He began to get the feeling that he was being watched, and worried that the coyotes, or perhaps even a bear, was now stalking him. He said that every so often he would wave his flashlight in the direction of the disturbance and yell in order to try and scare off whatever it was that was watching him. However, the noises still persisted, and this seemed to aggravate the creature. Luckily, the animal never came any closer or revealed itself to him, simply pacing around in the darkness and letting out the occasional growl. Just over an hour later, the truck pulled up along the trail, and my dad could see to his relief that John was now following the flashlight to where my dad now stood. The arrival of another person must have spooked the harasser, as he noticed hearing the crunching of leaves now moving quickly away from them. He told John what had happened, and the man reasoned that it may have been a bear, and that they probably shouldn't hang around. Together they wrapped the corpse in a cloth and managed to haul it into the back of the truck. My dad said that just as they were getting ready to leave, curiosity came over him, and he decided to walk over to where the sounds had been coming from only moments before. John got out as well, and the two of them scoured the area. Behind a fallen log, they found the half-chewed leg of the dead elk, along with a number of discarded candy and chocolate bar wrappers and a small length of rope. Further back into the tree line, they found a pair of nitrile gloves covered in blood and human shoe prints leading away from them. They also discovered the remnants of a small fire and a comic book. This had terrified my dad, the realization that it had been a person that had mutilated the elk, that had been watching him from the bushes and growling, so much so that he and John had agreed never to mention the encounter to anyone. My dad has told me that not a day goes by that he doesn't think about what he saw that day. He still struggles to comprehend what the person was doing out there in the wilderness in the middle of nowhere, how they had managed to kill the elk, and what their intentions were towards my dad. We relocated from the area in 2005 and now reside near Richmond, Virginia. My dad hasn't been back since and has said that he will never walk the Appalachian Trail again. I can't blame him, to be honest.
My event was in the mid-80s and included my son and our dog Ginger. When we had our encounter, we were at a shelter on the Appalachian Trail in Amherst County, Virginia. It was the Cow Camp Gap shelter. It was early December and very cold. It would get below 10 degrees that night. I am comfortable in the woods, and teaching my son skills needed to survive, to me, is a life skill like swimming. It's good father-son time. We arrived at the shelter shortly before dark, made a fire for warmth and hot food. The shelter faces south and has a spring-fed stream separating the shelter from the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail runs with an old narrow road separating and climbing north to the top of Coal Mountain. My son and I were in good spirits, sitting, talking and playing with Ginger. Ginger saw the figure coming out of the late twilight walking north. It was a surprise that anyone would be at that location, since the closest house was a hard 3 or 4 miles from the shelter. The figure came within 100 feet. The thing was tall and wore a dark brown fur coat. I was aware of Ginger's barking changing to something I had never heard from her before that event, nor after. Without thinking, I called out to the figure to come over and have some hot drink. That's when things got very difficult to explain. First, the creature turned to face us. Its face looked human in shape but not human in appearance. It turned its whole body. When the creature looked at us, Ginger's barking changed. Her hind legs appeared uncontrolled. Her sounds were not barking sounds but a gurgling noise. She was in great pain. I momentarily focused on Ginger reaching down to her, which did not stop her suffering. I looked to the creature, who returned to continuing its long, athletic strides, taking it out of sight very quickly. Ginger resumed barking her aggression warning, but not the same as before. The thing had turned to face us. My son said, "Dad, what just happened to Ginger?" I was thinking, what did that thing do to Ginger when it was 100 feet away? I was not fearful, and Ginger was a handful of golden retrievers. We spent a cold night with Ginger at alert the entire time. When we made our way to the warmth of my car the next morning, Ginger curled up with my son in the back seat and slept the 3-hour drive home. It would be 8 years later before I returned to the area. Ginger refused to follow me off Coal Mountain south towards the Cow Camp Gap shelter. When I got close to the woods half a mile north of the shelter, Ginger sat with ears perked, refusing my efforts to get her to come to me. I decided I would not go without Ginger. 15 years later, while on a Sunday drive to the town of Buena Vista, Virginia, a small town about 15 miles from the Appalachian Trail shelter, I would have a conversation with a teenage waitress. I mentioned my frequent visits to the Mount Pleasant Trail area. She said I should be careful and not go alone to Coal Mount, because about the time she was born, her uncles had seen something while they were deer hunting that had scared them so badly they would never hunt or go back to that area. She was 16, the time fit. I've since learned that the area had a fall and winter with dogs making a lot of noise at night with a large number going missing. A calf went missing without a trace. The owner was uncommitted as to what was going on but said his grandfather had a story about the brown man. He had not seen anything, but neighbors had. Something dreadful happened at that shelter in August of 2011. A hiker was found dead and half buried. It's now April of 2016. I have not heard of an arrest. I am interested if there are any similar accounts of these things harming dogs. I am a skeptic looking for an explanation for Ginger's actions other than Bigfoot having mind control capability over dogs. And maybe humans too.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.